Muy buenos días, estimados hermanos y amigos. Una vez más estamos aquí con ustedes con deseo de saludarles en el nombre admirable, nombre glorioso, nombre sublime, el nombre de nuestro gran Dios y Salvador Jesucristo, el Señor. Esto es Sembrando con Fe y Esperanza. Bienvenidos.
Biblical passages with the word apologia. The New Testament uses the Greek word apologia, often translated in English as defense, 8 times in the New Testament. All passages in this list are quoted from the English Standard Version with italics added. 1. Acts chapter 22 verse 1. Brothers and fathers, hear the defense that I now make before you. 2. Acts chapter 25 verse 16. I answered them that it was not the custom of the Romans to give up anyone before the accused met the accusers face to face, and had opportunity to make his defense concerning the charge laid against him. 3. 1 Corinthians chapter 9 verse 3. This is my defense to those who would examine me. 4. 2 Corinthians chapter 7 verse 11. For see what earnestness this godly grief has produced in you, but also what eagerness to clear yourselves, apologia, what indignation, what fear, what longing, what zeal, what punishment. At every point you have proved yourselves innocent in the matter. 5. Philippians chapter 1 verse 7. It is right for me to feel this way about you all, because I hold you in my heart, for you are all partakers with me of grace, both in my imprisonment and in the defense and confirmation of the gospel. 6. Philippians chapter 1 verse 16. The latter do it out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. 7. 1 Peter chapter 3 verse 15. But in your hearts honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you, yet do it with gentleness and respect. 8. 2 Timothy chapter 4 verse 16. At my first defense no one came to stand by me, but all deserted me. May it not be charged against them. 1 Peter chapter 3 verse 15 uses the word defense in a way that denotes the kind of defense one would make to a legal inquiry asking, "Why are you a Christian?" A believer ought to give an adequate answer to this question. The command to be ready with an answer is directed toward every follower of Jesus, not just pastors, teachers, and leaders. There are instances in many other passages when, even though the word apologia may not appear, the Bible either models or explicitly emphasizes the importance of apologetics. Consider a few. 2 Corinthians chapter 10 verse 5. Jude verse 3. Acts chapter 2 verses 22 through 24 and chapter 18 verse 4. Titus chapter 1 verse 9. Job chapter 38 verses 1 through 41. And Luke chapter 24 verse 44. Jesus the Apologist. Except for 1 Peter chapter 3 verse 15, the New Testament appearances of apologia all come from the writing or ministry of Paul. But was Jesus an apologist? Though the New Testament does not mention Jesus using the word apologia, we nevertheless hold that he was indeed an apologist. Philosopher Douglas Groothuis has carefully studied the question of whether Jesus was a philosopher or an apologist. After giving many examples of how Jesus rationally defended the crucial claims of Christianity, Groothuis concludes, contrary to the views of critics, Jesus Christ was a brilliant thinker who used logical arguments to refute his critics and establish the truth of his views. When Jesus praised the faith of children, he was encouraging humility as a virtue, not irrational religious trust or a blind leap of faith in the dark. Jesus deftly employed a variety of reasoning strategies in his debates on various topics. These include escaping the horns of a dilemma, a fortiori arguments, appeals to evidence, and reductio ad absurdum arguments. Jesus' use of persuasive arguments demonstrates that he was both a philosopher and an apologist who rationally defended his worldview in discussions with some of the best thinkers of his day. This intellectual approach does not detract from his divine authority, but enhances it. Jesus' high estimation of rationality and his own application of arguments indicates that Christianity is not an anti-intellectual faith. Followers of Jesus today, therefore, should emulate his intellectual zeal, using the same kinds or arguments he himself used. Jesus' argumentative strategies have applications to 4 contemporary debates: the relationship between God and morality, the reliability of the New Testament, the resurrection of Jesus, and ethical relativism. Apologetics in the Old Testament. Some falsely assume that apologetics began in the New Testament era. After explaining how Jesus and Paul engaged in logical debate both to destroy faulty beliefs and to propagate the Christian faith, philosopher J.P. Moreland observes, Jesus and Paul were continuing a style of persuasion peppered throughout the Old Testament prophets. Regularly, the prophets appealed to evidence to justify belief in the biblical God or in the divine authority of their inspired message, fulfilled prophecy, the historical fact of miracles, the inadequacy of finite pagan deities to be a cause of such a large, well-ordered universe compared to the God of the Bible, and so forth. They did not say, "God said it, that settles it, you should believe it." They provided a rational defense for their claims. 2. 5 reasons apologetics is important today. Reason number 1. We are all apologists anyway. Apologetics is not listed as a spiritual gift for teachers, preachers, or evangelists, as though only some ought to become apologists. Rather, all Christians are called to be ready with an answer. 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 15, Jude, verse 3. We all make a case for Christianity in some fashion or another. But are we doing it well? Beyond the specific Christian calling to have a ready defense for the faith, there is a sense in which everyone is already an apologist for something. The question is not whether we are apologists, but what kind of apologists we are. Christian author and social critic Os Guinness addresses this idea. From the shortest texts and tweets to the humblest website, to the angriest blog, to the most visited social networks, the daily communications of the wired world attest that everyone is now in the business of relentless self-promotion, presenting themselves, explaining themselves, defending themselves, selling themselves, or sharing their inner thoughts and emotions as never before in human history. That is why it can be said that we are in the grand secular age of apologetics. The whole world has taken up apologetics without ever knowing the idea as Christians understand it. We are all apologists now, if only on behalf of the Daily Me or the tweeted update that we post for our virtual friends and our cyber community. The great goals of life, we are told, are to gain the widest possible public attention and to reach as many people in the world with our products, and always our leading product is us. Reason number 2. Apologetics strengthens believers. Many Christians claim to believe in Jesus, but only a minority can articulate good reasons for why their beliefs are true. Yet when Christians learn good evidences for the truth of the Bible, for the existence of God, or how to respond to tough challenges to the faith, they gain confidence in their beliefs. For instance, I, Sean, lead high school students on an apologetics mission trip each year to Salt Lake City, Los Angeles, or Berkeley. To prepare for this trip, students attend weekly meetings and lengthy training sessions and read apologetics books. Then we go meet, have conversations with, and listen to lectures from some of the best thinkers from other faiths. The vast majority of these students come back with a renewed confidence that their beliefs are not only true, but also defensible. As a result, many grow more eager and willing to share their faith. Philosopher and apologist William Lane Craig explains how college students can gain confidence by learning apologetics. Typically, I'll be invited onto a campus to debate some professor who has a reputation of being especially abusive to Christian students in his classes. We'll have a public debate on, say, the existence of God or Christianity versus humanism, or some such topic. Again and again, I find that while most of these men are pretty good at beating up intellectually on an 18-year-old in one of their classes, they can't even hold their own when it comes to going toe-to-toe with one of their peers. John Stackhouse once remarked to me that these debates are really a westernized version of what missiologists call a power encounter. I think that's a perceptive analysis. Christian students come away from these encounters with a renewed confidence in their faith, their heads held high, proud to be Christians, and bolder in speaking out for Christ on their campus. Reason number 3. Apologetics helps students hang on to their faith. A number of different studies track how many students leave the church during their college years, and overall, the stats indicate that, after high school, between 1/3 and 2/3 of young people do leave. While they leave for many different kinds of reasons, moral, volitional, emotional, relational, etc., intellectual questions are one important factor. Young people have genuine intellectual questions, and when these questions are not answered, many leave the church. Both of us regularly speak at churches around the world and frequently meet afterwards with parents who say something like, "I wish my child could have heard you a few years ago. We raised her in the faith, but now she has strayed from it. She had questions that no one could answer and simply doesn't believe anymore." These stories are so common today, and they break our hearts. Intellectual challenges, just a click away, confront young people today more than in any other previous generation. We do, however, also frequently hear stories of how our books, articles, and videos, and those of other apologists, have helped people hold on to their faith in the face of challenges. Bottom line, if you want to train up young people to remain strong in the Christian faith, one vital component is training in apologetics. Reason number 4. Apologetics helps with evangelism. In an article about big issues facing the church, Pastor Timothy Keller says the contemporary church needs a renewal of apologetics. Christians in the West will finally be facing what missionaries around the world have faced for years: how to communicate the gospel to Muslims, Buddhists, Hindus, and adherents of various folk religions. All young church leaders should take courses in and read the texts of the other major world religions. They should also study the gospel presentations written by missionaries engaging those religions. Loving community will be extremely important, as it always is, to reach out to neighbors of other faiths. But if they are going to come into the church, they will have many questions that church leaders today need to be able to answer. People naturally have questions. They always have and always will. One of the key functions of apologetics, then, is to respond to questions and clear away objections people have that hinder their trust in Christ. Apologist, author, and speaker Ravi Zacharias emphasizes the important impact of an alert response to someone's question, even in a small way. Do not underestimate the role you may play in clearing the obstacles in someone's spiritual journey. A seed sown here, a light shown there, may be all that is needed to move someone one step further. In this book, we are going to take you deep. Yet our goal is that you gain knowledge not for its own sake, but for your preparation to confidently answer questions people may ask you about Christianity. If you want to share your faith effectively, you need to be ready with answers. Professor James Bilby explains the relationship between evangelism and apologetics. Evangelism and apologetics are closely related. Both have a common general goal: encouraging commitment to Jesus Christ. In fact, in certain theological circles, apologetics has been labeled pre-evangelism. On this understanding, apologetics clears the ground for evangelism. It makes evangelism more effective by preemptively addressing impediments to hearing the gospel. This is certainly true, but I submit that apologetics is also useful in the midst of the presentation of the gospel and after the presentation of the gospel. In other words, there is no moment in which a Christian takes off her evangelist hat and puts on her apologist hat. The relationship is more seamless than that. The difference between the two is one of focus. Evangelism is focused on presenting the gospel. Apologetics is focused on defending and commending it. There is, moreover, an important difference in the audience of evangelism and apologetics. Evangelism is done only with non-Christians, but apologetics should be done with Christians and non-Christians alike. Reason number 5. Apologetics helps shape culture. Apologetics and evangelism never happen in a vacuum. In our experience, apologetics questions come from both Christians and non-Christians because they both live in the same cultures, and the same world influences their thinking. Why are considerations of culture so important? Craig explains. They're important simply because the gospel is never heard in isolation. It is always heard against the background of the cultural milieu in which one lives. A person raised in a cultural milieu in which Christianity is still seen as an intellectually viable option will display an openness to the gospel which a person who is secularized will not. For the secular person, you may as well tell him to believe in fairies or leprechauns as in Jesus Christ. Or, to give a more realistic illustration, it is like our being approached on the street by a devotee of the Hare Krishna movement who invites us to believe in Krishna. Such an invitation strikes us as bizarre, freakish, even amusing. But to a person on the streets of Delhi, such an invitation would, I assume, appear quite reasonable and be serious cause for reflection. I fear that evangelicals appear almost as weird to persons on the streets of Bonn, Stockholm, or Paris as do the devotees of Krishna. Influential theologian J. Gresham Machen perhaps said it best. False ideas are the greatest obstacles to the reception of the gospel. We may preach with all the fervor of a reformer and yet succeed only in winning a straggler here and there if we permit the whole collective thought of the nation to be controlled by ideas which prevent Christianity from being regarded as anything more than a harmless delusion. Philosopher and apologist Francis J. Beckwith further explains, "It is fashionable today to speak of the theological posture of Western civilization, and American intellectual culture in particular, as post-Christian. Our most important, influential, and culture-shaping institutions and professions, law, medicine, education, science, media, and the arts, no longer accept the presuppositions of the biblical worldview as part of their philosophical frameworks. Thus, for example, it is not unusual, in fact it is quite common, to hear academic luminaries from different disciplines in assorted venues defend points of view that presuppose theological claims, and Christian ones in particular, are not claims of knowledge but rather religious opinions no different in nature than matters of taste. The ease by which these points of view are presented, and the absence of a call to justify them by the same standards of philosophical rigor that are required of their opposition, is testimony to how potently certain claims antithetical to the Christian worldview have shaped the ideas, opinions, and policies of those who occupy the seats of cultural influence in our society." 3. Christianity is a factual faith. Christianity is a historical faith. Christianity appeals to history. It appeals to facts of history that can be examined through the normal means of historicity. Pinnock defines these types of facts. The facts backing the Christian claim are not a special kind of religious fact. They are the cognitive, informational facts upon which all historical, legal, and ordinary decisions are based. Luke, the first-century historian, demonstrates the historical nature of Christianity in his introduction to his gospel. Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word have delivered them to us, it seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may have certainty concerning the things you have been taught. Luke chapter 1, verses 1 through 4, English Standard Version. Among these historical knowable events was the resurrection of Jesus Christ, an event that Luke says was validated by Jesus himself through many proofs over a 40-day period before numerous eyewitnesses. Acts chapter 1, verse 3, English Standard Version. Like the Gospels, Acts records history. Concerning the genre of Acts, New Testament scholar Craig Keener observes, Acts is history, probably apologetic history in the form of a historical monograph with a narrow focus on the expansion of the gospel message from Jerusalem to Rome. Luke's approach focuses on primary characters and their deeds and speeches, as was common in the history of his day. We hope then to present the historical facts surrounding the Christian faith and to determine whether the Christian interpretation is the most reasonable. Make no mistake, the historical facts matter for Christianity. The Christian faith is an objective faith, therefore it must have an object that is worthy of faith. Salvation comes not from the strength of our beliefs, but from the object of our beliefs. Yes, salvation comes through faith. Ephesians chapter 2 verses 8 and 9 and John chapter 6 verse 29. But the merit of faith depends upon the object believed, not the faith itself. Let me, Josh, illustrate. Once I debated the head of the philosophy department of a Midwestern university. In answering a question, I happened to mention the importance of the resurrection. At this point, my opponent interrupted and rather sarcastically said, "Come on, MacDowell, the key issue is not whether the resurrection took place or not. The key issue is this: do you believe it took place?" He was hinting at, even boldly asserting, that my believing was the most important thing. I retorted immediately, "Sir, it does matter whether the resurrection took place, because the value of Christian faith is not in the one believing, but in the one who is believed in, its object." I continued, "If anyone can demonstrate to me that Christ was not raised from the dead, I would not have a justifiable right to my Christian faith." 1 Corinthians chapter 15 verses 14 and 17. The Christian must avoid the attitude, "Don't confuse me with the facts, my mind is made up." For the Christian, the historical events reported in the Scriptures are essential. That's why Paul said, "If Christ has not been raised, then our preaching is in vain and your faith is in vain." 1 Corinthians chapter 15 verse 14, English Standard Version. Christianity is a testable faith. As Paul makes clear in his letter to the Corinthians, Christianity is a historical religion tied to the life, teachings, death, and resurrection of Jesus. These claims are testable in that anyone can actually examine their validity and determine historically whether they are reliable. As noted, Paul ties the truth of the Christian faith to the historical resurrection, 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 14 and 17. Professor of Apologetics Craig Hazen considers this one of the strangest passages in all of religious literature. He says, "I have not been able to find a passage in the Scriptures and teachings of the other great religious traditions that so tightly links the truth of an entire system of belief to a single, testable historical event. This idea that the truth of Christianity is linked to the resurrection of Jesus in a testable way does set Christianity apart from the other great world religious traditions in a dramatic fashion. When you boil it down, Hinduism, Buddhism, and the like are about inner personal experience and not about objective public knowledge. Other traditions seem to be about objective knowledge until you probe a little more deeply. Mormonism, for instance, seems to be about hidden gold plates, Jesus' ancient visit to the Western Hemisphere, and Latter-day Prophets, things that could certainly in principle be evaluated in an objective way. However, when facing evidence contrary to these claims, the Mormon missionary, scholar, or apostle steps back and begins to talk about the special inner knowledge, a burning in the bosom that is the only confirmation that really counts about these unusual stories. At the end of the day, the Mormon is no different from the Buddhist in that they both rely on inner experience as their ultimate source and warrant for religious knowledge. 4. Clearing the fog. 10 misconceptions about the Christian faith. When Sean was growing up, we lived in a small town called Julian in the mountains outside San Diego. Sometimes the fog would get so thick that while driving we couldn't see the car directly in front of us. Though the fog made the car ahead invisible, the fog didn't change the fact that the car was still there. Fog affects visibility, but the things it hides are no less real than they are on a clear day. In a similar way, many people have foggy views of the Christian faith, misunderstandings we hope to clear up before we get to the evidence. Misconception number 1. Christianity doesn't need evidence because faith is blind. Many atheist critiques of Christianity claim that faith is blind, irrational, stupid. In his book, The God Delusion, leading atheist Richard Dawkins asserts that faith opposes reason and calls faith a delusion, which he describes as persistent false belief held in the face of strong contradictory evidence. A common example used to show that the Bible denigrates evidence is the story of doubting Thomas. Dawkins writes, "Thomas demanded evidence. The other apostles, whose faith was so strong that they did not need evidence, are held up to us as worthy of imitation." Was Jesus repudiating an evidence-based faith? In Is God just a human invention? Jonathan Morrow and I, Sean, list 3 problems with his claim. First, Jesus predicted his resurrection on multiple occasions in the presence of the disciples. Thomas should not have been surprised at the return of Jesus. Second, Thomas heard eyewitness testimony, evidence, from the rest of the disciples, and yet still refused to believe. The vast majority of scientific knowledge we possess depends upon trusting the conclusions of other scientists, which is true for virtually all disciplines. Third, Jesus did many miracles during his ministry as proof of his identity. In fact, right after the story of Jesus scolding Thomas, John said the miracles of Jesus were recorded so that you may believe Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and by believing you may have life in his name. Despite what Dawkins claims, Christianity values the role of the mind, which includes the proper use of reason and argumentation. Jesus said to love God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind. Mark chapter 12, verse 30. The Lord said to the nation of Israel, "Come now, let us reason together." Isaiah chapter 1, verse 18, English Standard Version. Scripture and church history emphasize the importance of the role of the mind in discipleship and evangelism. In the Old Testament, God showered Egypt with miracles before inviting Israel to follow him into the wilderness. Rather than asking Israel for blind allegiance, God's miracles through Moses gave them good reasons to trust him. Exodus chapter 14, verse 31 makes this clear. Israel saw the great work which the Lord had done in Egypt, so the people feared the Lord and believed the Lord and his servant Moses. Miracles preceded the call to belief, laying the foundation for a rational step of faith. Even so, many Christians use the term faith to mean blind faith rather than biblical faith. But Christianity itself does not demand blind faith. In fact, quite the opposite. When Jesus Christ and the apostles called upon a person to exercise faith, it was not a blind faith, but rather an intelligent faith. The apostle Paul said, "I know whom I have believed." 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 12, emphasis added. Jesus specifically performed miracles to show who he was, and as a result, many confidently placed their faith in him. During a trip to Capernaum, Jesus healed a paralytic. After forgiving the man's sins, Jesus said to the crowd, "But that you may know that the Son of Man has power on earth to forgive sins," he said to the paralytic, "I say to you, arise, take up your bed, and go to your house." Mark chapter 2, verses 10 and 11. Jesus healed the man so people would know he spoke with authority from above. Professor of philosophy David Horner explains, "Faith and reason are friends and partners. They go together. They need each other and cannot flourish or even survive apart. Our faith should be a reasonable faith, and our reason should be a faithful reason, one that recognizes the inevitable and rationally necessary presence of trust and commitment. Trusting and committing yourself to what you have good reason to think is true and trustworthy, in those cases when doing so is appropriate or unavoidable, is the most reasonable thing you can do." Christians are often accused of taking a blind leap into the dark. For me, Josh, however, I found the evidence for Christianity powerful and convincing. So when I became a Christian, I hadn't leapt blindly into the dark, but stepped into the light. I placed the evidence I gathered onto the scales, and they tipped in favor of Jesus Christ as the Son of God, resurrected from the dead. Had I been exercising blind faith, I would have rejected Jesus Christ and turned my back on all the evidence. Of course, no one can absolutely prove that Jesus is the Son of God. My investigation of the evidence weighed the pros and cons. The results convinced me that Christ must be who he claimed to be, and I had to make a decision, which I did. You may be thinking, you found what you wanted, but this is not the case. Rather, I confirmed through investigation what I wanted to refute. I set out to disprove Christianity. I had biases and prejudices not for Christ, but against him. The next 3 objections are some of the most common ones we hear, but they also have considerable overlap. They each deal with the failure of Christians to live up to biblical ideals. For each of these, we hope you will recognize that Christians have, in fact, often fallen short of living as Christ teaches, but also that Christianity itself stands or falls on its own evidential merits, regardless of how Christians may or may not live. and such is true for any other belief system, too. This audiobook is continued on Disc 2.
La Iglesia Pentecostal Unida Latinoamericana en Baltimore, nos estamos reuniendo en la 8301 Liberty Road, 8301 Liberty Road, Windsor Mill, Maryland 21244. Y nuestras reuniones son los días domingo a las 8 de la mañana. Domingo 8 de la mañana tenemos el servicio de adoración, alabanza y enseñanza de la palabra de Dios. Venga juntamente con su familia y allegados. Serán todos bienvenidos a nuestra reunión dominical. Recuerde, Jesucristo es el verdadero Dios y la vida eterna. Primera de Juan 5:20. Y si otros días madrugamos a buscar la comida que perece, ¿por qué no hacerlo el día domingo para buscar la comida que a vida eterna permanece? Le esperamos.